Hey everyone, this is science fiction and fantasy author Lindsay Baroker, and I'm recording this on a Saturday morning. I'm going to take you behind the scenes of my Death Before Dragons series. Before I jump into editing the last book in the series, I thought this would be a fun thing to do. I'm just going to talk a little bit about, for those who have been enjoying the series, thank you very much if you have. If you've picked it up and if you've been reading, I'm going to talk a little bit about the process of how I design the characters, the world, why I jumped into urban fantasy from more of the high fantasy and space opera. And I will try not to do too many spoilers in case in case you're stumbling across this after only reading one or two books or checking out the audiobooks and maybe you're early in the series. But I am about to publish the 8th book, so there will be some hints of things that do happen in the series. So just to warn you. All right, so I'm going to start with why urban fantasy. I have traditionally been a fan of sort of galaxies far, far away, or what happens through the portal in an entirely different world. And that's most of what I read growing up, sci-fi and fantasy like that. And most of, honestly, what I still read now is when I'm just reading fiction for fun, and that's kind of what I enjoy. I've read a little bit of urban fantasy or contemporary fantasy, I guess is probably the more accurate term, since not all of it is very urban. And I don't dislike it, but it doesn't quite draw me as much. But so how I ended up doing this, and it's actually my second stab. Hardcore fans will have checked out my Rust and Relics series, written back in like 2013, a couple books. And I'm going to go back hopefully later in 2021 coming up here and finish that series off with a couple more books. But I actually was sort of, I don't say got my feelings hurt. I moved away from it because I had a lot of feedback that was like, oh, we don't like the first person narrator. This is too different than your other stuff. So looking back now, it actually has a pretty good review average and quite a few people have checked it out and asked where more or, when more are coming. But I got a little discouraged and I didn't go back to contemporary fantasy until the end of 2019. I was thinking about this series, and the main reason I set it on Earth and made it, our world plus dragons and elves and dwarves and shapeshifters and things, was because my first vision of the character Val Majire, I don't even know how to say the horrible name I gave her. It's supposed to be a Norwegian or a Viking for like battle maiden. My regular readers will know I love to curse the heroes with horrific names that, they were mocked for as they were growing up. But I envisioned the character. I was actually a little bit inspired by the movie Grosse Point Blank. Martin, the assassin hitman kind of character, this relationship he has going with his therapist through the movie where he's really trying to get help. And the therapist is like, maybe you should change careers. Don't kill so many people. And I thought, I could see that would be kind of fun to do in a fantasy setting. So I could have this heroine who's kind of also working with a therapist. And in the case of my lady, she's in her 40s and has a kid and has some health issues. So she's in some ways very typical of the genre, sort of that snarky, tough, badass lady. But just by being a little older than sort of the typical character, and maybe by being half elf too, whole background on that, she's a little different than average. And so I thought that'd be really funny to do. And I just couldn't really envision that so much in a high fantasy or epic fantasy kind of setting. I'm sure you could do it. But anybody, if you've read the books, book 1 opens with her hanging on a cliff, climbing down to this cave to attack a wyvern that's a criminal, that's killed some kids. And she gets the call from her doctor and she's got health issues going on too, and the referral to the therapist. And I was like, she needs to have like an iPhone, it needs to be a modern setting. So that is sort of the genesis. Is I came up with the character first, and then I figured out, how can I do this in a modern setting, do all the fantasy stuff. And, and there's obviously a whole genre of supporting urban fantasy now, but I wasn't as familiar with it as a reader. So I did read quite a few that are out there now, some of the, big names, and also some indie authors that are doing really well over on Amazon. And as usual, what I was planning was really not super typical, not really to market or having all the familiar tropes, but there was enough. I did see some with elves and dwarves and things like that. It wasn't all just vampires and shapeshifters. So that was encouraging to me. And I said, let's go for it. Hopefully this time, I even decided I'd write the first 3 before publishing any. And I kind of do that often now so that I couldn't be discouraged by early feedback if it wasn't what I hoped for. So that is how I ended up doing urban fantasy. And I will jump into now a little bit more about the characters. I've already told you a little bit about Val and how she came to be. I kind of knew I was going to set this in the Pacific Northwest because that's where I grew up and that's what I'm most familiar with. I grew up in Edmonds, which is north of Seattle. And up until a few years ago, my parents lived there until they retired. And so I visited pretty often, even after I moved away. And when I started thinking of Val, I wanted her to have some power, not be quite human, have some powers. And I thought, well, I always have loved elves in fantasy of any kind, whether it's Lord of the Rings or Dungeons and Dragons, So I thought, well, let me make her a half elf, and then she can have grown up here and be basically human-like. But part of the series is her discovering a little more about her heritage and getting to meet her father eventually. Bit of a spoiler there. But yeah, so and as an elf, she's got a little extra agility. I gave her a little extra strength, a few things that will help her out because she's fighting basically supernatural, werewolves and things that also have greater than human powers. Have you ever noticed that almost every race in fantasy is better than human, except maybe the goblins and the gnomes, although they usually have high agility and are pretty smart, right? So that was her. And because she was going to be half elf, I just envisioned sort of the tall, lanky, pretty blonde girl, which is really different from the heroines I usually write. I don't usually write like the super gorgeous types of heroines. But I gave her some health issues and some stuff to work through. So hopefully she's not too much of a Mary Sue kind of character. And also because she was going to be elven anyway, I thought I'd make her like her mom's half Norwegian. There's that's actually my mom's half of the family too. So it's kind of fun to poke into especially in the first one, I took some of I didn't want to do the mythological bent too much because I've seen that done quite a bit. And it's not something that's as exciting to me as just making up things. Or I actually enjoy the Tolkien-esque, like I said, dwarves and elves. Just having grown up reading so much of that, I always enjoy those sort of types of characters. And obviously those came based out of our mythology, but bit of a tangent there. So I gave her sort of the Norwegian background, and there is actually a big community, sort of the Ballard area in Seattle. So that's kind of her human half. And she has army experience. That's kind of where she first learned her powers. Or she learned that she healed better than usual, I should say. She actually is just kind of learning that she can do more things as the series progresses. But that's where she learned how to fight. And eventually she got recruited to a task unit dealing with magical beings that have come to Earth to hide out from their own political system. And that kind of evolves over the series too. But I will go ahead and tell you about the next character, who I can still barely pronounce his name, Lord Zavnaquatel. Zavradnaquadel. See, I can't pronounce it. I feel bad for my narrator. Vivian, if you're watching this, you're such a trooper pronouncing my dragon names. That's a bit of a joke just because dragons always seem to have such horribly difficult to pronounce names. But fortunately for Vivian and for Val, who also can't pronounce anything, he just goes by Zav in the series. And with him, I knew I wanted to bring dragons into my contemporary fantasy, even though that's a little less typical. But it's something that my first series did not have any dragons. I sort of didn't even intend for them to become a thing that I became known for. But I've kind of gone with it and put them in more series because they have been kind of fun. I've made them probably the atypical, not the just total monster guys that are laying on their hoard of treasures. And so he has to come to Earth. He's also hunting criminals, the very criminals that are hiding out on Earth. So that's his reason for being there. And also his reason for butting heads with Val in the very first few chapters. He ends up throwing her Jeep up into the tree and wrecking it, which is an ongoing thing, that bone of contention that comes up a number of times in the first few books as they become less enemies and start working together. And possibly he becomes the love interest later on as the story continues. And with him, I just imagine this haughty, arrogant dragon because they're all super powerful folks. So why wouldn't you be arrogant? And I mentioned in one of my character videos that the actor that came to mind when I was envisioning him was Cliff Simon about 20 years ago in Stargate SG-1. He kind of had a minor role as a recurring bad guy named Ball. And he had this short hair and this is trimmed. I think he had the mustache and beard and this black robe, and he just kind of oozed that arrogance. And I even stole the glowing eye thing from the Goa'uld in Stargate. because he was just such exactly how I imagined Zav, just this sort of really haughty, arrogant personality. And of course, he mellows as the series goes on along, mostly to Val. And she's kind of working on getting him to actually learn her friends' names and to care. But so that was sort of the actor I had in mind, and that helped me just really imagine and write Zav. And we'll see too why he's kind of a dick in the first book. As the series progresses, we get more about him and why he's being sent to Earth and on this menial mission, as he believes it is. Another character that came out in the series, which is basically Val's best ally, is Sindari. He is a silver tiger, which looks a lot like a white tiger because that's what you can find on the stock photo sites. And he was inspired actually by the first fantasy series that I really read and that stuck with me. Like I read some fantasy as a kid. I was more into historical stuff and animal stuff, in grade school. And then I think the end of middle school, high school, I found all the Forgotten Realms books, and I found R.A. Salvatore's Drizzt books. And Drizzt in the series has I think it's like a black panther, a magical being that he can call forth to help him fight. And it's always kind of fuzzy. I mean, he's written more books. I haven't kept up with it, but I had read the first 10 or so many times, and I never quite knew how to say the name. I think it sounded like Guinevere, but the spelling was very unique. And I think it was a male cat, or it's kind of fuzzy, and it probably doesn't matter. But anyway, so that was sort of the inspiration for, I wanted to give Val a sidekick, I guess. Sindari would be terribly offended if I called such a regal tiger as himself a sidekick. But I wanted, you'll see a theme in all of my series, especially, more recent ones, is that I love writing dialogue. I love the interaction between characters. I like banter and snark, that kind of stuff. And that's really hard to do if your hero is off by themselves. So I've done the Sentient Sword. I did Jaxie in my Dragonblood series for my heroine Sardell. And it's very typical now that there's going to be a companion of some kind, if not two human type characters. And we've had the Sentient Swords. Now we got the tiger. I don't know what will be next. Maybe even Yanko in my Chains of Honor series got a parrot. The parrot doesn't talk much except to curse at him. But that's another behind the scenes for another series. So that was the inspiration for Sindari. And he has some of the similar rules where he can be called forth to Earth, but the rest of the time he lives in his own special realm. And so he can only spend a limited amount of time on Earth. But when she needs him, she's got a powerful ally. The last character there's quite a few minor characters, especially as the series progresses, but another main one that is throughout the series is Willard, which is who is Val's boss, basically. She does some freelance stuff, but mostly she's kind of an independent contractor for the government. If they need some trolls that have been killing people taken care of, Val's the one to do it. Since she is half elven herself, she has a little more power. She can sense magical beings than your typical human agent. So the inspiration for Willard, I knew she was an Army colonel at a fairly young age. She's kind of in her mid-40s in the series. And I just, having done 4 years in the Army myself, I have met a lot of, Willard type characters. Sort of, she got the accent, but I made her, she's really smart too. She works in intelligence. That's what her background. So she was just a fun character. I've met a lot of folks from the South when I was in the Army. So I just immediately imagined her as kind of that tough, she lifts weights, she does triathlons. She's a tough lady. So I needed for Val someone who could really take her down a notch, that wasn't intimidated at all by the fact that Val is a good swordswoman, and has, the extra abilities as an elf. So that was a good foil for Val, and their relationship grows over the series too. I really enjoyed book 4 where they were working together and we got to know a little bit more about Willard. All right, just a little bit about why I picked Seattle. You could probably guess that since I grew up in the area, it makes the most sense. Unlike in secondary worlds that are made up, I actually had to get most of the things right as far as locations of things that actually exist, like Lake Union and Lake Washington and the Space Needle and the underground tour. The underground tunnels in book 1 are far more extensive than in reality, although I did read about it, I did the underground tour many, many years ago and was super underwhelmed by it. There's not a whole lot you can go underground in Seattle since it's basically at sea level, but it was rebuilt after there was a big fire around the turn of the night, I guess it was late 1800s in there somewhere. And so there was stuff rebuilt on other things. And so there is an underground. But I did find a little tidbit on a Wikipedia article, I think, that was describing it, that said there's actually a lot more down there than is the few little rooms and under street things they show you in the tour. So I was like, that'll be fun. We'll have some dark elves down there messing around. So I actually originally was going to set the series in Bend, Oregon, because that's where I live now. And that's where Val's mom actually is. So that's why they end up spending quite a few chapters down in that area, down in the first book. But as I was writing it, I was like, yeah, Seattle's more classic setting for urban fantasy. And also it has a lot more nooks and crannies and different, terrain. Like Bend has cool stuff. We have neat things too. We have lava tunnels and, not so ancient or not so inactive volcanoes. But I don't know, just for the city setting, Seattle kept calling to me. So eventually Val's mom moves up there later in the series. And it's mostly based around there, although we do go to other worlds. I couldn't help it. I had to have an elven world, a dwarven world. There's hints of other worlds too. I think I know they go to the gnomish world because I wrote these, so I know what happens in theory. And that was fun too. That was sort of bringing in some of the epic fantasy or high fantasy kind of stuff I enjoy too. But yeah, so that's why I picked Seattle. It's a pretty cool area and there's a lot of history, despite it only being, I don't know, 150 years old-ish. Anybody in Europe or even the East Coast of the US would be like, they don't have very much history at all. Like my bathroom is older than that entire city, right? But yeah, it's and it's got a lot of fun terrain. And I took a lot of digs at the Seattle rain, especially later in the series. We learn that Zav, our dragon hero, his world is a little hotter and drier. So he's always complaining. And Val's mom gets a sauna and Zav finds it. And he's hanging out there all the time. He's super into anything warm. So if you haven't read that far in the series yet, that's something kind of fun in the last, I think, 3 books is when that takes place. All right, just the last thing I thought I'd cover in this behind the scenes is just the cover art. This is a little different for me because I changed art and design after I did the first 6 books with Gene Mullica, he does a photo shoot. You kind of get to pick the models. I will say it was very hard to find a Val that was old enough looking for my character. So if you look at the covers, you're like, wow, she's really young for someone in her 40s. To some extent, that I get away from that. I said Val does look young for her age because she's half elf. But yeah, it can be tough to find models that aren't just those perfect, pretty early 20s kind of people. But overall, he did a good job. The models are great. And what he does is he does one photo shoot just with like 1,000, probably 1,000, at least hundreds of different positions. And then you can kind of pick a position that they're in. And then he does sort of an illustrated background. And those tend to be, a little more quickly, can be put together a little more quickly than fully illustrated, covers. And that's why the first 6 are that way. I had originally, actually, before I contacted Gene about doing the series, I had contacted Louisa Pressler. She's over in, I think, Germany. And I stumbled across her artwork because she'd done some stuff for one of the Ilana Andrews books. And I was like, wow, that's amazing. She does great people. That's super hard to find is artists that, like, there's a lot of really cool landscapes and things and fantasy covers, but really up close face looking at the person is tough to find artists that's really good at that. And she's great. So I had actually contacted her first and said, can you do the first 3 for this series I'm going to be starting? And I was already starting to write them. And, she gave me dates and she got the first 3 exactly on time. But at the same time, I was writing them pretty quickly. And I realized I wanted to do a lot more than 3. I wanted to do at least 6. And anybody following along knows I'm working on book 9 now, which should wrap things up. But because I wanted to do so many and because I was writing faster than she was creating them, I was like, I didn't want to be in a position where I was waiting on the art in order to be able to publish the books. So I ended up going to Gene at that point and said, like, hey, can you do these? And so he did the first 6. Actually, he did 7 because The Forbidden Ground it's a free novella out there. on YouTube, the audiobook is free. And then if you sign up for my mailing list, there's an ebook with some extra scenes with Zav from Zav's Points of View. And that's also free. But anyway, so he did the first chunk. And then after 6, I actually had at that point all of Luis's art and a fourth one that I had ordered. So I went ahead and I did a prequel novella. No, actually, it's pretty much a novel. I think it ended up being about 60,000 words. So that's Mist and Magic. So I used one of her illustrations for that. And then I had kind of stopped at book 6 and was like, well, I could actually wrap things up at this point because I've ended this dragon storyline that I had. It was sort of resolved at that point. But I also had, readers wanted more, and I kind of still wanted to do some more too. So I did another trilogy, and I kind of made it's Secrets of the Swords 1, 2, and 3. So technically they're books 7, 8, and 9 in Death Before Dragons also, just to confuse people with a lot of numbers. But by making it this kind of trilogy, I felt, well, it won't be as weird that I've changed the cover art in the middle because it's sort of it's like an extra thing. So I've also got Luis's covers on those 3. And I will share the links to both Jean's gallery below and Luis's because they're both amazing, do amazing stuff. And if you are an author yourself and thinking of getting some cool cover art, you can check them out. Neither are super inexpensive, which was what you would expect for that kind of quality. So just a heads up, if you're just getting started, like a lot of my earlier covers are just sort of the grabbing stock photos and stock photo manipulation with like Photoshop. So that's perfectly legitimate. Some of my best-selling series, they just have real simple covers with, like I said, stock photos. So I guess that's about all I'm going to talk about today. Hopefully you've kind of enjoyed this. I'm not sure how long I've been rambling here. I do like to wander off on tangents. But if you have any more questions about this series, or you'd love me to do a chat like this on one of my other series, please leave a comment below and just let me know if you can. If you want to like this and subscribe to the channel, that would be awesome. I think if you're subscribed, you'll get updates when I do new videos, or I've been posting some of my audiobooks too. So thanks so much for listening. I hope you have a great 2021. Bye-bye.